Hi all, and welcome back to the neighborhood. We're giving TinHiFi another shot today with the all-new TinHiFi T3 Plus. I previously reviewed the original T3 from TinHiFi and thought that it was a pretty unique IM, especially with gaming in mind. But the T3 looks nothing like the original, with a redesigned shell and an entirely different driver configuration. So let's get into it. Build-wise, TinHiFi seems to be moving away from its traditional metal, bullet-shaped shell to a more traditional ear-shaped design. The shell here is comprised of resin and employs a dual cavity strategy. It's pretty lightweight and has an ergonomic fit in the ear that I find comfortable for hours of use. The connection at the shell is a flush 2-pin, and the cable that is provided with it terminates in a 3.5mm jack. This is the same cable that came with the TinHiFi T5, and like my evaluation of it in that review, my re-evaluation of it here will not be a favorable one. It tends to kink up with use, and it's relatively thin and feels mostly cheap overall. Coming from TinHiFi, this was a disappointment, as they have been known to include some pretty good cables with their IMs in the past. But this isn't one of them here, so I'd suggest picking up an alternative cable like the balanced triple and Zoni cable that I did much of my testing with in this review. I'll place a link to that cable in the description below in case you consider picking one up. Inside the shell of the T3 Plus is an LCP or liquid crystal polymer dynamic driver. This is another difference from the original T3, which has a single BA and an additional dynamic. LCP implementation has been pretty popular as of late, as a number of other IMs in and around the same price of the T3 Plus have also employed a single dynamic LCP driver, such as the Moondrop Aria, Tangem Hana, and others. So in comparison to those other LCPs out there, can the T3 Plus keep up with its own implementation of the liquid crystal polymer driver? The short answer here is yes, but with a caveat. The caveat here is that the T3 Plus is rather tip dependent, meaning that its sound does change rather dramatically, depending on the tips that one selects. This includes the 2 sets of tips that TinHiFi has chosen to include in the box. The set that comes affixed to the IM itself in the box is made of a simple black silicone, and I'll be straightforward in saying that with this tip, the T3 Plus did not produce my favorite sonics. You see, with this tip selected, the bottom end was a tad bit too smushy and the top end a bit too rolled off. With that said, some may be willing to put up with these outcomes, especially those who prefer a more laid-back presentation. While this wasn't my preferred auditory outcome, some might prefer this auditory equivalent of riding in a Cadillac or some other similar car, which might be described as a sofa on wheels. At least it had that kind of feel to it. Luckily, TinHiFi also included a second set of tips with the T3 Plus. One's composed of a more transparent gray silicone. In fact, with these tips, the T3 Plus may actually be my top recommendation around the $75 price point, at least keeping up with, if not surpassing, other recent recommendations such as the Moondrop Aria or Blonde A8. And while each of these IMs also have their particular strengths in comparison to the T3 Plus, strengths which we'll get into later when we talk about comparisons, I think the T3 Plus at least pulls a notch ahead of these others when it comes to recording accuracy, clarity, and resolution. While not as well defined as some of the best IMs in the $100 and above price category, it certainly is one of the best IMs I've heard under $100, and that's for sure. Having said that, detailing was much more transparent in the mid-range and higher frequencies in this IM than it was from sonics coming from the low end. In fact, I would say that its bottom end is really this IM's Achilles heel, and while its low-end precision is at least on par with other standouts in the price range, such as the Moondrop Aria and Blonde A8, it does feel somewhat limited and incongruous in its performance in comparison with the rest of its own sonics. So while the gray silicone tips did improve the lower end performance of this IEM to a certain extent, it's still not perfect in this department, and ultimately more diffuse, fuzzy, and one-notish in its presentation than I would like, even if it's not necessarily uncharacteristic of other IEMs in this price range. With that said, there is some mild sub-bass roll-off, even if its extension is relatively good otherwise. Moving on to the mid-range, the mid-range performance is clear, consistent, and neither too far forward nor too far recessed, riding the midline well in terms of its ability to deliver a detailed image without any hints of harshness or aggressivity. Vocals follow this pattern as well, and I never felt that either female vocals were too intense or that male vocals were ever held back in any way, shape, or form. With the gray tips, the treble presentation is also decently extended and well defined. The T3 Plus isn't going to win any awards for air quality, but there is a sneaky bit of air here or there that comes across on tracks where it is needed. The sound here appears accurate to the recording, neither detracting from original sonics nor over-embellishing them. But where the T3 really excels is in its staging. While the staging in the T3 Plus is not the absolute largest, it is still a staging monster for the price. The stage itself has a mild W shape to its presentation that is not only somewhat unique, but also natural sounding in its delivery. Sonics in the true middle are presented as slightly further back in comparison to those on the very side, with those sounds in between, the true middle and the peripheral, being perceived as slightly further back in comparison to those focal points. Put in other words, the stage is relatively even with some slight forwardness in the middle and even more forwardness coming from amongst the staging's periphery. Width of the presentation floats somewhere above one's shoulders, and depth and height of the image are similarly distant but out in front or on top of the listener's head at times. Images are also well spaced within the soundscape, and the T3 Plus offers its listener good image distinctiveness and instrument differentiation amongst its overall sonic presentation. So separation is good enough to deliver an enchanting sonic picture to the T3 Plus's listener within an accurate soundscape. Individual note weight appears neither too lush nor too thin, and unlike other TinHiFi products, which have tended to err in timbre on the bright side of things, I have never found the T3 Plus to be either too bright or excessively warm in its presentation otherwise, even across a variety of amplification. In other words, the timbre of the T3 Plus is relatively neutral, or at most slightly warm in its tonality. Compared to some others that I have recommended in the price range, the T3 Plus is somewhat more polished in its sound and its delivery in comparison to something like the Blonde A8 or even the Moondrop Aria, both of which come across a bit more raw in their presentations overall. For example, both the bass and the treble of the T3 Plus are a bit more controlled than they are in either the A8 or the Aria. There is also less treble glare and more sophisticated staging, and better instrument note separation with the T3 Plus as well, even if it may come at the cost of some mild extension deficits in both directions with the TinHiFi IEM. Still, some may actually prefer the rawer, more extensive presentations of either the A8 or the Aria in comparison with the T3 Plus, which could come across as being too polished for some and might be boring. Furthermore, others might still prefer either a heftier, more sub-bass focused bottom end in the A8 or the additional treble of the Aria compared to the T3 Plus. Yet, with all of that said, as the market sits at this time, I would still put the T3 Plus's performance right up there with these other two, as all three are great IEMs at around the $75 price point right now. And I think that pretty much sums it up. The TinHiFi T3 Plus are some of my favorite IEMs to come out from TinHiFi yet. Even though the bass is somewhat their Achilles heel, it is in line with the price range, and if it had a better bass, it probably would be a more expensive IEM. In any case, the T3 Plus is definitely better than other things that TinHiFi has put out recently, such as the TinHiFi T5 or the T2 Evo. So with this IEM, TinHiFi may be steering its ship back on the right track, At least that is my hope, as I have enjoyed a number of their previous offerings in the past. Thanks to Linsol for sending in the T3 Plus to the channel for nothing more than an honest review. A link to how to purchase the T3 Plus from them will be listed in the description below. Also, make sure to hit subscribe here and leave a like on this video before you go. And if you can, consider leaving a comment as well. This will appease the fickle gods behind the YouTube algorithm. But you can also consider joining the neighborhood at all its other access locations, including Instagram, Twitter, www.InToItReviews.com, the Discord, or become a member of the Patreon. I'll place links to these various locations in the description below. And as always, I appreciate you all and all of your support. And with that, I'm out for now.